Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening. All right, Mary, you're number 5.
Okay, my number 5 was mentioned earlier. It's Styx by Carl Edward Wagner. To tell you the truth, this was one of those stories that I guess I have both a personal and a creative association with. So maybe that's why it ended up on the list. When I first met Brian Keene, he told me, we were talking about favorite short stories, and he said, he goes, one of my favorite short stories is Styx. And I don't really feel like you can be a horror writer unless you've read Styx. And I didn't say, well, I've never read Styx, but I did go and rectify the situation, and I'm glad I did. And I think that, because it partially reminds me of Keene, but also because there is a beautifully developed quiet horror story in Styx, and it on a couple of different levels. It's increasingly sinister in both an external and internal way. I think that we get something, first of all, that we can kind of relate to because, if I remember correctly, the main character is an illustrator for horror and sort of talks about the kinds of things that we can relate to as creatives in terms of, deadlines and working with people and making sure that you get to the sort of the heart of the project that you're working on. And it offers that possibility that your art is going to kill you, or your art is going to, another story I think we talked about earlier about how I think Marc mentioned it, about how your art can drive you mad. And it's to me, it's cosmic horror because it has that sort of first of all, that element of inevitability that Laird mentioned, but it also has that sort of that what the antagonistic force is something bigger than us, and that no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to get around it. And I have to say, I do agree with Keene that it is a classic of horror because it not only reflects horror for the average person, but it reflects a kind of horror in a symbolic way that only creative people understand, that digging that deep sometimes into what makes us who we are and what makes us able to write the things that we write, that maybe someday that's going to be detrimental to us. And I think it's something that creative people just tend to swallow down and ignore, but Styx is a story that kind of brings it out in the open. And I like that. I can appreciate that. I can respect that.
Laird.
Oh, I second all that. I didn't even look at it. It's right. It's about an illustrator or an artist right before he's doing like one last little hike and doing some fly fishing, if I recall, right before in the Catskills, right before he has to go off to World War II, actually. But to me, I look at it, I actually just focus in on obsession, which artists are obsessive. So in other words, the fact that he's an artist, that's important, but it's the obsessiveness. It's not the art that will kill him, or kill you. It's if you obsess over things that can lead to detrimental outcomes. It's a cosmic horror story. I agree. It's utterly, because cosmic horror is it's like right there in the dictionary beside inevitability. There is, what else could there be? There is only this. I like all that. So I'll leave it there with the story because I agree with all that. I think she said it perfectly. Should intrigue you to go read it. I will say this though, just in general, Carl Edward Wagner wrote a lot of great stuff. He wrote crime, mystery, suspense, some stuff that has absolutely zero or really minimal supernatural intrusion. He was a wonderful editor. I think his greatest gift to us was editing over all those years. Yeah. That's how I ran into him reading his year's best horror back when I was younger. And like, if I picked Styx as well, but I could have easily gone with Where the Summer Ends.
Yes.
Which is one of the greatest endings that will ever be written in a story. I don't know if I won't say it's the best, but it is enshrined as, it would be like when they put Clint Eastwood, Paul Newman, and everybody on the same line. You know, that's how it goes.
I agree.
But 222 Swift, The River of Night's Dreaming. Just that one right there shows you eroticism. I mean, because he's a burly, hurly, manly man of the John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, Paul Bunyan variety of writing and life, and yet he's able to write these delicate. I feel that way about Peter Straub. You meet Peter Straub, but he's this a bear of a man. Jeff Ford, same thing, a bear of a man. Yes. And yet, when they roll up their sleeves, they sit at the piano, they take a sip, and then the most delicate music can come out of that piano. They can also hit those harsh notes too, but if they want to, they can just very delicately hit those little pink keys. And he proved he could do that. Styx is one of those stories that it is what it seems. It's very simple, but it touches on a lot of things that I think make horror great. And I recommend, if you like it and you start reading Wagner, you will appreciate him even more if you can like find anything out about his life. His life, tragic and stirring in equal measure, will inform. He's one of those writers that I think Paul Bowles another one, although less admirably. But reading about them will really inform your appreciation of their writing.
I agree. And if I can just add one more thing, just to kind of piggyback on what Laird said, his life and his passing, I think, reflect that same delicacy, that same sense of the beautiful and the ephemeral.
The ephemeral, yes.
That the horror sort of. Sorry, we have the bikers going by. But it's that sense of the beautiful and the ephemeral, and for like you said, for such a big burly man's man kind of guy, he could write in a poetically beautiful sort of way, and both about that ephemeral beauty and about the underlying horror beneath it. And it's admirable. It's really incredible stuff.
Did you just say that
Styx
bikers?
Is the first, by the way, Styx is the first story that I read of Wagner's, and of just immediately I knew this is an author who has great strengths. But I also had seen his name as editor of several books, and so I knew his name beforehand. But then I remember reading it and thinking, oh, well, he's a great writer too. And I need to read more because it's a book that I've read, a story that I've read collected.
Right.
And I know a lot has been made about it, inspiring Pizzolatto for True Detective. And I think that's bullshit. I don't even know if he read it. But who knows? You never know with that thing, as I know you've learned all too well. But what Pizzolatto's read or not read, but Styx is a foundational story in the horror community. And it's one that writers talk about for good reason.
Absolutely.
And there's several, but before we move on, I think it's important. Did you just say, Mary, did you say bikers, like, motorcycle riders?
Oh yeah. We have a biker bar up the road from where we live. And every once in a while we get the lot of them riding by and with their music and their motorcycles. And
this may be apocryphal, but I don't think so. I believe that he was interested in motorcycles, like, very much.
Oh, really?
So it was an omen.
Oh.
It was a sign.
I got
go. I'm sorry.
So I just thought that was because I've seen pictures of him in a motorcycle, like in the not wearing colors, but so anyway, I just thought that was
right. Yeah.
Okay, Laird, you're number 5.
All right. Let me get my little thing back up here. All right, what do I gotta say? I could have. You could almost just reach into a hat for this guy because a lot of writers are typified by two or three or a handful of great stories, right? Mm-hmm. But and so this writer is too, but only because that's sort of like the memory space that a lot of people have to hold in their mind. You know, I can only remember like the big hits from these three bands. You know, that's right. All I've got though. They're three big hits. When Radiohead, for example, has been doing dozens of them that are almost, you could pick one or another and not lose anything. This writer is one of those. I actually came to him pretty late. I mean, I know I read him once again in the Dark Descent anthology, Larger Than Oneself, but the story that I've selected is The Hospice by Robert Aickman. Robert Aickman, I think very quietly, has had a tremendous influence on the weird fiction community, if nothing else, and a sui generis sort of influence in that I don't think that you can imitate Aickman successfully. I think it would be really obvious. And I think somebody like Cormac McCarthy, I mean, the great authors are actually easy to parody because they have these beats that you're like, I wish I would have thought of that. And then you do it, but it's just you trying to imitate Van Gogh or something. Right. The bottom line is he has this distinct style, and yet it's elusive as oil on your hand. There's just it's slippery. And The Hospice is essentially it's a nightmare. Is how I actually did an essay about it a few years ago, a very lengthy one actually, and I deconstructed the story. But the thing is that like many of his stories, I've kind of come, and I'm no Aickman scholar, but after reading 4 of his collections, kind of in succession here a few years ago, I didn't understand some of the stories from like Cold Hand in Mind, which is where this story was originally published or collected, until I read Wine Dark Sea or something, back and go, oh wait, the punchline's in another story 2 collections down the road. And he doesn't give a flying rat's ass whether you ever put that together or not. His most commercial top 40 story is Ringing the Changes, I would say, about the undead. This was probably in there only because so many people have collected it. But essentially it's just a guy that goes to this hospice, but it's a hospice in a different sense of the word. It actually is almost like a rectory / old folks home / hospice. And the events that unfold there are, and one of the reasons I selected him for the top 10 is because he represents quiet horror, but not the way that Charles Grant or some of these other Joel Lane, people like that truly are quiet. M.R. James, no, elliptical and elusive, and I don't know, what happened. I'm gonna have to read this again, and you get something new out of it every time. All I'll say about it is just it's one man's nightmare. He gets bitten in the leg. He's looking for this place he's supposed to go. It's dark. Something bites him in the leg. He assumes it's a dog, but maybe it was a dog. Who knows what it was? And he goes into this place, and it, very much like Roald Dahl, it just starts escalating slowly but surely. But you're not going to get with Aickman, you will never get, except maybe in a couple of his really popular, Pages from a Young Girl's Journal is another top 40 type of thing, where you get like a conclusion that you can sink your teeth into and say, yeah, that's what happened. I think this will haunt you. You'll be playing with this Rubik's Cube long after you've read it. You'll have to go back.
I agree. I think of Aickman as like, if other stories give you a sense of horror or dread or terror or even disgust, Aickman gives you that sense of unease. Like it's the feeling that I imagine animals must feel before a storm. It's that kind of feeling, and
this incoherent dread.
Yeah, and because of its sort of nebulous nature, there's almost something I think more horrific than if you're actually confronting the horror head on, because it's that panic that you can't just sort of logically talk yourself down from, because you're not sure what you're talking yourself down from.
But it's there. Your primitive brain recognizes it, and and he does just enough because you don't just read an Aickman. You need to read a bunch of his stuff to really get it. But the point isn't to get it. It's like abstract art. It is to experience it, and it's like he gets in your brain with a pick, and he's up. There goes your foot moving. It doesn't matter why it did. He just hit the right nerve. And highly recommended, but not in the same way that anybody else on this list that I've recommended for a functional 3-act structure. Right. It is if it turns out to be your thing, it is a nightmarish, always in the corner of your eye, and if you turn your head, it's still in the corner of your eye. That's how I read him. No matter which way you look, as to quote Brian Evanson, it's still behind. It's still right. It's right there, and you're never going to be able to look at it directly.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, I agree.
All right, Marc, your number 5.
My number 5. Again, I guess you're going back classic, and this is another writer who's obviously known for science fiction, but he's very familiar with horror. I think if you've ever read it, and this story, while science fiction, I think falls right in that horror square, which is The Veldt by Ray Bradbury. I was familiar with this story just from reading The Illustrated Man, again, when I was younger, although I guess it was published. I mean, Illustrated Man is just sort of it is an anthology, but it's kind of put together about an illustrated man who's got different stories. But The Veldt, it's interesting in rereading this, how true it's almost become. This is a story of some parents who come home in the near future. This was written in 1950, and the nursery in that future is almost like a holodeck from Star Trek, right? And the children have done something to manipulate it to make it an African Veldt, and the parents are quite disturbed by this. Why aren't they doing something fun? And at one point, the father even threatens, "Hey, I'm going to take it all away. I'm going to shut down the automatic house," which is kind of like, I'm taking your phone away. But the kids are somehow addicted to being in this nursery. And again, this is another story where the kids are just a problem. And I have a kid, but yeah, they're just a problem. And in the end, guess what? The kids are a problem. Without revealing more than that, it's a classic story. Most people have read it, but rereading it as an adult, I've read it several times in my life. I always find something new. Bradbury's really good at just these little subtle hints that he puts in. And then while there's a sort of this expressed overt conclusion to it, at the same time, there's just a little language in it where, someone and then they recognize where they had heard the scream before and stuff like that. It's just, and again, I know this has been adapted because they made The Illustrated Man into a movie, but again, just a fantastic story. I saw Bradbury after he had a stroke. He came to a local theater. Actually, he was with Douglas Adams, and he did a brief reading, and he read a little bit out of this story, and it was just fantastic. And I loved it. Again, almost all of my top 5, with the exception of one, I just love these stories. And again, to me, it's just classic. Can't go wrong with it.
All right, I've got another science fiction writer writing horror. This is another story from The Future is Female, edited by Lisa Yazik. Lisa, if you don't know Lisa teaches science fiction at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. And so it's amazing that there's a person who teaches science fiction as a thing. I'm incredibly jealous of her career. And she lectures you can find her lecture on this story on YouTube. If you search this story on YouTube, it comes up. But the author is Judith Merrill. And Judith Merrill was a part of the science fiction group called the Futurians. That was Isaac Asimov, Frederick Paul, who she was married to for a while. And she was a radical voice. She was an anarchist, Trotskyist, like in the 30s. And Judith Merrill eventually left the United States to protest the Vietnam War, and she ended up becoming a Canadian citizen. And she left behind the largest collection of science fiction in the world, supposedly, to the library in Toronto. And her only stipulation was that there be a bed in there that people could lay down and read books. So you can go read that. Anyways, this story is also in her Best of Judith Merrill collection. And the story is called Only a Mother. And it was written in 1948, and it is a post-nuclear war story about women giving birth to mutated children. in the aftermath and the radiation after nuclear war. And keep in mind, this is 1948. This was written. And it was her second professional sale. Her first sale was a detective story. And this second one, she was a really amazing pioneer of science fiction. And this story is brutal. You can read it multiple times and just you'll be flabbergasted that it was written in the 40s and so forward, thinking about the horrors of nuclear war. And it's just a really devastating read. And then if you read it, then watch Lisa's lecture about it. It's just a really fun experience. I highly recommend doing it that way. So yeah, Only a Mother by Judith Merrill, and more people should know Judith Merrill. We did a whole panel tribute, and Lisa was on it on Dickheads, so you can find that too. I know I'm shamelessly plugging my podcast, my other podcast a lot. So Mary, you're number 4.
All right, my number 4. We're getting down to the big guys here. You know what I picked for my number 4 was The Things by Peter Watts. It's probably, I think, of all the stories on the list, maybe one of the most recent. And I picked it because I've always been one of my favorite movies of all time is The Thing. And I think it is perhaps one of the most, and of the 2 remakes of the book, I think John Carpenter's version is the superior one. Not that the original movie didn't have its own innovations. It did. I think it won an award for like the dialogue. It was realistic. People overlap. They talked over each other, things like that. It was, but I thought that John Carpenter's version just sort of perfectly captured paranoia and horror in its essence. What I liked about The Things, which is in essence a retelling of The Thing, but from the alien's point of view, it shows how much point of view in a story affects something. And I've always been a softie for the alien, the mutant, the non-human creature in a story. Maybe almost disturbingly so. Like I root for the monster a lot of times because I think that there's a scene in The Thing which I think probably perfectly encapsulates what you get when you read The Things, which is the scene where the creature has taken over one of the crew, and he's out in the snow, and he's not quite finished changing yet. So he looks mostly like the guy he'd taken over, but he's got this sort of claw hand, and he's on his knees in the snow, and he looks up at the guy who's about to torch him with the flamethrower. And for just a second, I don't know how the actor did this, but for just a second, you can see the horror and the fear in this creature's face. It knows what's going to happen to it. And then they just set it on fire and it starts wailing. And it's the kind of thing where if you're rooting for the good guys, as you probably should be, you might not even notice it. But the whole story of The Things is this creature talking about how confused and scared it is because all it wants to do is share this experience, which is bigger than any one creature can possibly imagine, that it has been to countless worlds. It doesn't consider what it's doing killing anyone. It doesn't consider what it's doing even assimilating. It considers what it's doing to be sharing this multi-world experience, this timeless experience from multiple viewpoints and multiple places with this new race of creatures. And it can't understand their hostility toward it. And it's a survival story from the alien's point of view. And there's something just so, sometimes and you see this more lately, sometimes they try to retell a story from the villain's point of view, and it's hit or miss whether or not they nail it. But this story nails it in a way that is so beautifully tragic and still horrific, because this creature doesn't recognize that what it's doing is essentially eradicating individuality. the things that make human beings human.
When I heard about this story, I thought, wow, that's some balls to write that story. And I poo-pooed it and I read it, and it was really, really incredible. And I should say also that Peter Watts wrote a short novel called Freeze Frame Revolution a couple years ago. It's one of the best science fiction short novels that I've read in the last decade. And he is a brilliant writer. So I was really happy to see that on your list.
I'll be honest, I have never heard of this story. I also read Free Frame Revolution. I thought it was a genius idea. And again, The Thing is one of my favorite movies and one of my favorite stories. Who Goes There is one of my favorite stories. I definitely will be checking this out. I had no idea this even existed until it just came out of your mouth there, Mary.
Oh, so I think you'll love it. I mean, I'm pretty sure you can find it online. The first place it was published, I believe, was Clarkesworld magazine in 2010. Okay. But I think I don't think I'd heard about it till sometime after that, and I'm pretty sure I found it somewhere online. So it might be that he gave it to some website to put up in case people want to see it, because I really think if you love The Thing, then you can appreciate the effort that went into this particular story. It's really beautifully done. Yeah,
he did a great interview with Geek's Guide to the Galaxy about Freeze Frame Revolution, where in the interview they talked about this story, and I highly recommend that interview as well, because that's why I ended up going and reading it, was because I first when he talked about it, I was like, come on, dude. And then when he started talking about it, I was like, okay, come on, dude, let's do this. And I wanted to read it. So yeah, great stuff. Laird, you're number 4.
All right. Just a quick sidebar there. Or a continuation, I guess. I love Who Goes There. I would like to see a faithful adaptation of that. Because nothing, Hawks may be a little more faithful. Carpenter's own thing, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. Not a complaint. But I would love to see It's in the Milk. I would like to see the almost bloodless adaptation of it, because it was just it was even more paranoid, because the things were vying against each other, and each entity was completely discrete. They did not they did not cooperate. They were killing each other. Yeah, let's torch them or whatever they did. I don't think they torched them in the original story. And the other thing I was going to say, I don't want this to be a spoiler, but I think it's important. So you set up the story beautifully, Mary. The ending is controversial in the community extraordinarily, for a couple of reasons. They're probably obvious, but also because of the effect that it has on everything that came before. Everything you said is brought into question by that last line of that story. Its point of view. Right. I think that's quasi-spoilery, but we're talking about quasi-fan fiction at the highest level of something we all know. So going into that story, that's another little tidbit about it. All right, so my number 4, by the greatest horror writer who's never going to be recognized as a horror writer, Paul Bowles, By the Water. And you can find this in his Delicate Prey. Once again, these Paul Bowles stories were written in the late 40s, early 50s. I haven't checked, but that's kind of the time period. He lived in Morocco, so a lot of his stories are set, in Morocco or South America. Some are set in Mexico. This one is kind of vague. I think it's set at least partially in Morocco. But essentially, it's a story about a young guy, kind of at loose ends. I think he's potentially a grifter, but it's really hard to tell. He's definitely streetwise, who decides that he wants to go just blow off some steam in another town. I mean, a lot of Bowles' stories are so interesting. It's just people are just doing things. There isn't like, well, the salesman is heading somewhere and it's very important. I mean, he does that. He does those. But no, somebody could just be like, I was picking flowers. I was having a picnic. I was just standing around, and then some shit goes down. There's like no history, no backstory. It's just, in media res, I was just, some shit started happening to me one day while I was like looking out at the ocean. So this guy goes to another town, and what's really interesting is it's just the claustrophobic nature. He gets there, it's dark. He doesn't know the town very well. He wants to go to the baths. And the entire description of him being sort of ushered down through these layers of this old, like, stucco tenement building in the 1940s or 50s in a place that doesn't really value architectural safety or sanitation or lighting, and it's just dark. And this little kid comes up to him and says, "Do you want to go to the pool? Was it Lagraz's pool?" And he's like, "A pool? I want the baths." He goes, "It's the pool." And they go down this tunnel, and the kid's holding his hand, and they get down there, and it's literally standing on a cliff with these stalactites hanging down, looking at this. There's like 2 naked bulbs and then darkness beyond that goes, they say, forever, essentially. And I don't want to spoil it, but basically the owner of the pool is someone who is, you kind of get the impression, possibly a crime lord, but even more importantly, like a mythological figure to the people. They live in a superstitious awe or dread of this owner of the pool. And he tells our hero, "You can't be here, get the hell out." And our hero's like, "Fuck off," essentially. And the man has no arms, no legs, and kind of a flipper tail, which sort of horrifies this kid who's never encountered this before. And he kicks him into the pool. He's just like a soccer ball, just like poop. And everybody is outraged, and they start coming after him. And the rest of the story develops from there, him trying to get away. Well, obviously it's one of the reasons I picked it is because Bowles is really, especially 50 years, 60 years on, Bowles is extremely problematic for various reasons. The world has moved on. I think he might have been problematic in his time. And obviously, I think there's something to be examined very critically about horror that says that someone who has birth defects or mental disability, they're not cishet, white. Oh, that's the object of horror, right? That used to be a big part of horror. Oh, somebody's gay. That means they're evil or there's something wrong. Someone has a birth defect. I think this works in spite of that. Like I would see, content warning people that part of the horror, I think in Bowles' mind, was predicated upon this person, basically having deformities. But I think it works on a much more fundamental and primordial level because the other people there have accepted him. There are old men swimming with this guy. He has to come up out of the water like a seal and confront the intruder. Other people they may be afraid of him, but they're swimming with him. They're not in any kind of terror. Their awe of him is more like Jesus is among us type of thing. Now he's mad today. Now I'm like, oh shit, I'm scared. But generally Jesus is a cool guy. So I think it's very important for that. And the horror really derives for me from the effect, the will. What kind of will does this person have? Because there's a point in the story where the guy thinks he's safe and he's out. He's like, he goes to a place in town where there's more lights and he's like drying himself off and he's kind of freaking out, but he thinks, okay, it's over. And this little urchin comes up and says, "He's hunting you. You better come with me." And then it goes on from there and he has people out in the streets looking for him. And he may be looking for him. He says he's going to turn you to a bird when they bring you back to him and all this horrible stuff. I could go on about this. This is what, and of course it has a traumatic ending. And so I included it as a naturalistic horror story. It's not a quiet horror story. It could be supernatural, but it's almost like a folklorish horror story, which I included instead of including Machen or Blackwood, because the Wendigo or the now I'm losing it. The Willows would have been real. Yep. Would been real solid choices for this kind of thing, right?
Right.
But I decided to go with because they're like exemplars of the weird.
Right.
I feel like this is something. Those are stories that people are probably heard of. They may even had to study them in class. This is something that most people are never going to run across because Bowles has completely fallen off the radar. Genius writing and a genius sort of naturalistic expression of the weird. Weird and horror. I mean, there's definitely horror, but that horror, that the weird, we like to think of it as, well, it's got to be supernatural explicitly. And the reality is, no, we live in a weird world and we make up stories about the things that these people made up stories about this guy. And I think the power of storytelling is something that is sort of a genuflection to that in this tale.
Well, I've never read Paul Bowles. I got to be honest. And you've sold me completely. So I will be checking him out.
It's brutal. He's brutal.
Yeah. All right, Marc Rothenberg, you're number 4.
All right. Going back to what Laird just said, which is sort of what defines horror. This is a relatively new story to me. I read it maybe a couple of years ago, and I was really blown away by it. It's we're all familiar with the concept of, you know, the anthropomorphism of animals, Watership Down, and you know, animals that think like humans, and there's a reason that animals, I don't think, really think like humans, and I think this story defines that, which is the infamous Bengal Ming by Rajesh Parmameswaran. Now, I haven't read anything else by this author. I read this on I forgot what Granatomy, a website about stories, and this was a love story, and it is a love story. It's from a book called the I Am the Executioner Love Stories, and it's about a tiger in a zoo. And this tiger named Ming, he's a Bengal tiger, and it's told from his point of view, and he's been cuckolded from his girlfriend by another male tiger. He's had a terrible life, but the one light spot in his life is he's in love. And the whole story starts off with the premise that he's in love, and he's in love with his keeper, which is a guy named Kitch. And as I said, it's nice to read stories where animals think like humans. This story reminds you that animals are, and I know I'm talking to David Agranoff here, who, you know, animals are to be respected. Animals are, there is a place. They are to be respected. They're to be treated a certain way. They are to be cared for, but they are not humans. They are animals. And this story squarely falls into that. Kit shows up, but as the story goes on, you keep hearing little things in the back of this tiger's mind, which is, I'm kind of getting hungry. You know, he's telling all these great things about his life, with, you know, the story about how he got cuckolded by this other tiger named Maharaj, and how Kitch is showing up and it's going to make it all great. And then Kitch doesn't show up and he's heartbroken. But in the back, he's like, what's that smell? I'm getting hungry. And frankly, it's instinct versus this pomorphism, pomorphicism, I suppose, that really draws in the horror, because in the end, he's a tiger. And it's very clear horrible things happen because you're not expecting them, I think, to happen in this story, because you're like, hey, he's a talking tiger. No. I've read this story. I have also listened to, there's an audio version of it I've listened to, which is done very well, I think, on Nocturnal Transmissions, which is a podcast which does sort of, you know, with sound effects and stuff. I think it's a very good story. Again, it's, yeah, you know, animals are animals and humans are humans. And there is a horror in that, in the way we sometimes think, oh, look, my dog's happy, he's wagging his tail, when your dog is just like, give me food. Or, you know, I have a new cat and the cat meows a bunch. The cat's like, give me food. But that cat will tear into my corpse and eat me if I die. That's just the way it's going to be. He's not going to mourn me. And you know what a tiger's going to do, what a tiger's going to do. And it is horrific. And the end is very horrific, but beautifully written. And it is a love story in the end, but a love story that a tiger might say, not a human.
That sounds like a great story.
Yeah, I'll have to check that one out. All right, so my number 4, I could probably read the story faster than we've talked about most stories. It's a very, very short story. And I got to talk about how I heard about this story, because it was kind of a test of very early on in my time of being actually a part of the horror community. I went to the Bram Stoker Awards in LA in 2004. And I heard this story being talked about by some luminaries in the field. The late, great Dennis Etchison and David Scow were talking about this story. And I happened to overhear them talk about this story, about how it was such a brilliant story. And so I went out and got the collection that it was in. And it was the first story I read because I heard them talking about how brilliant it was. And I felt like a dummy, because the first time I read it, I was like, what's the big deal? And this story is Red by R.C. Matheson that was collected in Scars and Other Distinguishing Marks by Richard Christian Matheson. This story is about a page and a half. And the first time I read it, I was just like, what? I don't even know what happened here. And then I was like, I told myself, well, these two brilliant writers said it was genius. So start over and read this page and a half again and slow down and read the details. And this is a story that you could very easily just not catch what's happening. And then with one sentence at the end, you go, oh shit. Okay. And it literally took me twice reading it. And then I said, oh shit. Red by R.C. Matheson. I can't say much more about it. Because we're talking about Richard Christian Matheson, we should mention that his father was also a brilliant short story writer. I could have picked 100 different Matheson stories for this collection or for this list. And, it's really cool when you get a chance to, and I've had the chance to meet RC or to meet Richard Christian Matheson. And I've also had a chance to meet his father, and the kind of brilliance. The only time I've ever been starstruck the entire time I've been in this field was talking to Richard Matheson and talking to him about I Am Legend. And I literally was like almost crying because I was like, holy shit, this is the guy who this came out of his brain. But I will say that this story read by R.C. Matheson. Has anybody else here read that story?
I have not.
No. Okay.
I have not.
Yeah, it's a really intense one. And hearing Dennis Etchison talk about it, because a couple of years ago, we had him as a guest shortly before he died at the Horrible Imaginings Film Fest. And I was curating the literary side of the festival. And so I got to revisit the story with Dennis and say like, hey, I read it because of you. And we talked about the story, and another great crotchety writer, Dennis Etchison. But talking to him about this story was great. And Dennis Etchison could easily be on this list 1,000 times. He is a fantastic short story writer. And if you ever got the chance to talk to Dennis about the craft of short stories, that was really a phenomenal experience for me. And one of the things that he, in relation to this story, that he said to me personally was that this story is one of the best examples of one line of dialogue crushing the reader. And what he related to it with me was, and look at who his father was and how his father was a master of the same thing. And specifically, we talked about the dog chapter in I Am Legend, which ends with a crushing last sentence. And what this pair, this father and son as writers, were good at doing was having one line that kind of deconstructed everything that you read before it. So David, have you ever read, and when you were just speaking about the one line aspect, the first thing that came to mind, coincidentally, totally, was Richard Matheson's story, Dress of White Silk. Did you ever read that? I'm sure you have. Oh, yeah, of course I have. Yeah. And the first time I read that when I was much younger, I read it and I was like, I'm missing something here. And I had to carefully read that story again, and you get what was going on there, right? And when you just said that, it was very much that reminded me of that story. Yeah, and Red is an example of I felt really dumb. When I figured it, I was like, why didn't I get this the first time? And maybe I've overhyped it for everyone out here, but I could just tell you that was my experience, and that's why it's my number 4 story. And it's funny because when I first started this list, it was on my honorable mentions, and then I read it again, and I bumped it all the way up to number 4 because I kept like pitting this story versus that story, and it made it all the way to 4. So, Mary, you're number 3. I think this author's going places.
Yeah.
I already made that joke, but
by this newbie Stephen King. There are a number of his stories, particularly, particularly, the old stories, but there's a couple of new ones that I debated putting on this list other than this one story. But this one story for me captures what I think the appeal of Stephen King is, and that's The Monkey. And it's a story essentially about a man and his sons, but most of the story takes place in a flashback to when he was a kid. And it follows along the same lines of what I think of as push the button stories. Like you push the button, but you're not really sure what's going to happen, but it's going to be something bad. But for whatever reason, you push the button. And what I think King does pretty masterfully is that at some point you don't even have to push the button. The button starts pushing itself. And it's basically about this guy, Hal, who finds a toy monkey, one of those monkeys that have the little symbols that crash together. And he manages to make this toy absolutely terrifying. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's one of the perfect examples of what I always thought Stephen King did best. He takes your basic, your average Joe and puts them into a supernatural situation that is just kind of on the fringe of reality. And it's just horrible enough that it's not over the top, it's just horrible enough that you almost feel like it could happen. And even in a supernatural sense, sometimes the concepts are weird, like, fingers in a drain or, whatever the case is. But this one, I think, really captures what he gives you the same feeling reading these stories that you get when you're young and you're about to go out Friday night, that sort of excitement you have. It's a summer night. It's going to be warm. Your friends are going to be there. It's going to be great. That's the kind of feeling you get diving into a Stephen King story, especially the old ones. And I think that this one sort of captures that maybe better than most. And like I said, there were a number I could have put on. I could have put N. I could have put The Reach. I could have put I Am the Doorway, but what made me love Stephen King's work, what really solidified me as a fan of his work, of all the things, all the novels, all the short stories he's ever written, was this story. Because I read it as a kid, so I could understand it from the kid point of view. I reread it as an adult, and I could understand it from the parents' point of view, and it works for me on multiple levels.
Yeah, and spoiler alert, we have another story from Skeleton Crew on this list. But I do think Skeleton Crew is when King was at the height of his powers, and just that collection is just unfuckwithable on many levels. Laird, your number 3.
Yeah, 2 things. I love that story, and I agree with the other alternate picks, Mary. And also, I have to say, my favorite of all of his short stories. I'm not saying it's his best. Just my personal favorite was The Last Rung on the Ladder.
That's a great one.
Just because I lived in the woods and my brothers and I were left alone all the time, for like up to weeks at a time, and we depend on one another. And we're talking like 12, 13, 10. My youngest brother was 5, 6 years old. So that really hit me. The kids that had to just have absolute trust.
Right.
But yeah, it's a wonderful pick. So for my, let me pull up my little thing here. My third, it's by a writer that I really admire. This story was first appeared in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, as so many great stories, including The Dark Tower, novellas, there were released as a serial novel. There's all this great stuff. Many of the authors we've talked about were in there, but Ray Vuksevich, he wrote a couple novels. He wrote some collections. One of my very favorites is called Whisper, and this came out. I want to say like in the mid-aughts, something early aughts, something like that. And I include it on my list because, well, why the hell not? It's really a great story, but also it has a little humor in it because Vucevic is typified. His writing is typified by a very light touch. It's very intricate. He's also a master of digression. He'll lead you, into these greener pastures, and then you take a very sharp turn at some point. You may even do a 180. But the bottom line is this story is about a guy whose girlfriend has left him because he's essentially just hopeless. He's not even a bad guy. It's just, I'm tired of you, Bill, type of thing. And by the way, you snore, Slam. And he's like, I don't like, she's giving him this laundry list of dissatisfaction, but it's the snoring. And he's just like, which I guess is probably revelatory about why she left him. He's like, hell with all the other stuff. I snore. I don't snore. But now he's talking to the door and he's like, well, fine, we'll settle this. So he goes out and he gets himself a long running tape and he puts it in and he takes some cough syrup or whatever and he knocks himself out, and then he plays it, fast forwards to the next day to hear if he snores. And he's chagrined to find out, God damn, I snore really loud and I fart and all this other stuff. Holy cow. But then he hears voices like somewhere around 2, whatever the dead dread hour of the wasteland of night is, he hears these voices, and it's a man and a woman. And he deduces, I forget what he did for a living. It's an office job, but his brain's bigger than whatever the job is. And so he's like a hobby, he's one of those hobbyist chemistry, paleontologist, Nancy Drew types. And so he's like, oh, she must, from the way they're standing, this is where they're standing in the room. And they have this cryptic conversation. There's nothing really sinister, but it's just like, oh, he's so cute when he's sleeping, and a couple things like that. And I won't give you any more than that. I think that should be enough. But he goes through hell to try to catch them in the act, to find out what's really going on here.
What era was this published in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction?
I want to say 2002 or
okay.
It could even be the late 90s, but it feels like it was early aughts because or maybe that was when it was collected in Meet Me in the Moon Room. A lot of his stories have to do with surrealism. Mm-hmm. Like there'll be these weird stories, like where there's one where there's a couple sitting on a couch and they're chatting, and he goes, I wonder, they're talking about parallel universes, and she puts a bag over her head. She goes, I'm in another universe. And he puts a bag over his head, and sure enough, he can see there's like this whole vista opens up, and then there's these weird things that telescope from there. And he wrote some I won't say hard science fiction, but from very straightforward science fiction that make you bawl like a baby at the end. And then he would write these kind of quirky stories that had a dagger. They didn't always see the thing that really made him dangerous or makes him dangerous is you don't know when that's going to happen. Some of these writers, it's going to happen. That's the fun of it. Him, it may not happen in the story. You may just be really worried all the way through, and it's like, and it's over. You're like, okay. Then the next story he gets you. But Whisper is, I would say, one of the great. I would put it as like one of the classic horror stories. There's like an element there's almost like a ghost story aspect to it, in the sense that
sounds awesome. I read it.
Yeah, like they're phantoms. Matter of fact, I think Small Beer Press makes it available online as a free sample. It is worth the 20 minutes of your time to read, and I'll leave it at that. It's just has one of the last. I would say right up there with Where the Summer Ends. I was bragging about that earlier. Mm-hmm. It's also on that title line with all the Eastwood and Newman and everybody gets top billing. It's a fantastic last line.
Okay, Marc Rothenberg, you got a classic here too.
Yeah, again another story I just love. Read it early in my life, and I'll every once in a while pick it up and reread it. And that is Pigeons from Hell by Robert Howard. I think. Yeah. First of all, I love stories that take place in the backwoods somewhere in Louisiana, or, the Choir of Ill Children. I love some backwoods shenanigans, right? And this story has that. I also love the concepts of cultural supernatural aspects. And this has that in there too. And this story is It's basically two travelers. I think it was written in the 1930s. Two travelers driving down the road. They come to a mansion, an abandoned plantation. They go inside. They spend the night. One of them gets horribly murdered in the middle of the night. The other one freaks out, trying to figure out what to do. And the sheriff shows up, and the sheriff just happens to be coming back from where he was going, doing sheriff things. And he's like, hey, what are you talking about? And they go inside, and sheriff explains that there's some history behind this place. It's called the Blassonville Manor, and the family owned slaves, and they were horrific people, and they treated people, their servants and their slaves, poorly. And but he doesn't believe that there's anything supernatural going on, just sort of stories about the place. And then it turns out, no, he was horribly wrong. There's absolutely supernatural stuff going around. But to determine it, that they go see one of the people who was alive back then, who happens to be living in like a shack. And wow, Laird just got really small. He's living in a shack. He did. It was weird. That's horror right there. He's living in a shack, and he tells him this story, and the story of zombies and Haiti and Zuvembes and all of this thing, and it all really comes together really, really well. And again, the end of the story isn't what you would have expected, because you would expect, oh, this totally makes sense why this happened. But there's a bit of a twist at the end, and it hits the story really well with the beats that go on. There is an adaptation of it I remember seeing a long time ago on Boris Karloff's show Thriller, which I thought was done really well. Again, it's just...
Oh, I've seen that one. It's really good.
I saw the title of this. Yeah. I first saw the title of this story, and I was like, before I ever read it, I'm like, Pigeons from Hell, I guess. But, I liked Robert Howard. I liked the Conan stuff, and this kind of was my first diversion outside of that Conan realm. And, man, it still stands up today. Like I said, I just reread this stuff in the past couple of weeks. It's just a great story.
On a side note, you reminded me that Boris Karloff's Thriller also did a pretty good adaptation of yours truly, Jack the Ripper, by Robert Bloch.
Yes.
And
my wife got me that a couple of years ago. I still watch it. It's great.
Yeah. That also, which was also made into a Star Trek episode, not so well. But Pigeons from Hell is a classic. I do love that story. Does anybody else have anything they want to say about Robert Howard before we move on? Because I know he's a big subject, but
love him.
Yeah. You really can't go wrong with Robert Howard, and I think the tortured nature of his life is really bleeds through on the page, and that's one of the things that appeals to me about Robert Howard, is because it kind of feels like you're reading a jagged, rusted edge of a knife whenever you're reading his story.
Oh, it's rough. It's rough. This story is rough. I mean, on the surface, it's not. On the surface, you're like, oh, okay, it's a story about this, this, and this. But it's really not, right? It is like you're reading something jagged and rusty and crotchety and angry. There's some anger to it, right?
Yeah.
But again, Conan the Barbarian. So there you go.
Now, my number 3, I almost didn't I hesitated with this one because it's a very popular story, and my number 1, the same thing, but I had to, because it's just a foundational story for me as a reader, and I think it's a classic for a reason. And I considered many stories by this author, and Marc, you have this author for number 2 with the story that I debated. So you really hooked me up with that. But this story is Midnight Meat Train by Clive Barker. And this to me is Clive Barker on the map. This is Clive Barker laying down the gauntlet. This is the story that on the surface it could look like just a gory killer story, but there's all the weird cult stuff going on underneath the surface. There's so many levels to Midnight Meat Train that there's just so much going on there that I think whereas like in the hills and the cities, for example, is a story that shows how weird he could be. And the one that you picked, Marc, shows how weird you can be. And there's something to that too, to the fantasy level, but just for a just sheer, like, make your gut twist weird story that is still effective when you read it now. Even with the kind of movie that got made that we can just kind of put out of our memory, the story just works. So I think my number 3 is Midnight Meat Train by Clive Barker. I think it's one of his best, even though the title makes me cringe because the vegan in me just, a little bit. But anyways, anybody want to comment on? Well, we're going to talk more about Clive Barker in a little bit. But anybody? I don't
know why the vegan in you makes you cringe with that title, because let's be honest, that's not the kind of meat we're talking about on that train. So
yeah, exactly. But yeah, Midnight Meat Train, great story. That's my number 3. So, Mary, your number 2 is a novella and an author who I'm just so glad is on this list somewhere that we get a chance to talk about. Mary, tell us what your number 2 is.
My number 2 is Safe by Gary Brombeck. And I of all the fiction that I've read of Gary's, all of it has that sort of that heartbreaking, soul-crushing, like poor kicked puppy dog kind of quality to it. But this one, I think, impressed me on, again, it was a multiple level thing. It impressed me as a reader because it is basically just one gut punch after another, and the gut punches just get harder and harder and harder. But as a writer, there is a deftness to the way Gary approaches things. And I'm not sure if it's in his description or in just the aching and glaringly obvious vulnerability that is just inherent in all of his work, but in particularly in this one. And it's about something which, when I read it, predated actual, like the increasing rash of school shootings. And so it struck me as something, I think, horrific, more so because at the time it wasn't as commonplace a thing. I mean, it's horrific that you could ever even say that school shootings are a commonplace thing. But I had read it before they had regular, lockdown procedures and things like that. And there are certain places that we just assume are always going to be safe. We more or less assume our office buildings when you go to work are going to be safe. You assume your home is going to be safe. And in a further step removed, you assume that a school is going to be safe because you're entrusting those people with the most precious thing in your life, which is your children. And that it would not only not be safe, but not be safe because of one of those children, I think is a terrifying concept. And he manages to do it in a way that is both it's heartbreaking and it's horrific, but it's also sensitively done. And for being as brutally honest about the topic as it is, and as unflinchingly violent as it is, it's still, it manages to be more a story of actual horror. It's not so much where you're scared that something's coming up behind you kind of thing. It's a story where you're horrified that these events are taking place. To me, it's true horror in that truest sense, that it elicits that emotion of horror in this kind of unstoppable violence, because I think people are just shocked and sort of blown over, and that's how you feel when you're reading it. And it's so powerful and incredibly done. And I've been, for like the 20 years that I've known Gary, every time people ask me, what's one of your favorite, short stories, I always mention that one because it has stuck with me that well and that long.
I haven't read this. Where can I find that?
I believe it's in I think it's in one of his Cedar Hill collections. I can't remember the name of it. I'm drawing a blank. It's the one with the graveyard, I think.
Well, and reading a Gary Bromback story is like that moment when you twist a rag to get the final little bits of water out. It's like his pain and his pain, like just it feels like that moment when you're squeezing the last bits out. There's nothing like the feeling of sadness and pain in a Gary Bromback story.
Yes.
It's just, and then when you meet him and it's just like, you just want to hug the guy. It's okay.
Does you feel he needs it? Is that why?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I can't remember the name of the collection I had read it in. I'm
sure you'll
track it down.
Cedar Hill story, I think. But if I can get it, I can email it to David to give to you.
Great.
Laird, you're number 2.
Yeah. I couldn't put Peter Straub on here. And I would have to say of almost any author, Peter Straub probably is the most influential. I mean, there's a lot. There's Louis L'Amour, there's Robert E. Howard. I was reading him when I was like 8, my first Conan story. But there's a bunch. This is another one, though. I'll pick another New Yorker that I can. The guy I never met, never hung out with, who has influenced me, especially the last 20 years or so, for a certain type of writing that I try, because this guy does it so well. And that's T.D. Klein, Petey, which is in his, I would say, much like Polyphemus by Shea, it's a landmark collection, 4 novellas. And I selected, I could have selected any of those. They all are master classes, not just horror, but of the discipline of novellas. But I picked Petey because it's the word I'm looking for. It is so much of the 70s and how it is. There's like this gothic 70s gothic sensibility. Like you could just feel the dark ages of suburbia in all his work, but in that one especially. And it's a story about a fairly well-off, upper middle class crowd of people that come to a housewarming at this mansion. And I hesitate to say that there's a POV. It's that there's like 30 people in this story, and they're all pretty much equally important or disposable, depending on how you look at it. But it's like, the story is written in a lot of ways like a one-shot tracking shot. There's not all of it, but huge chunks of it are just.
I hadn't thought of it that way. That's great. Yeah.
You can see he writes it so smoothly that you can see the camera moving, just following feet and then legs and then cocktail glass. And you could just see it'll pull back and you'll see the whole room. The voices intercutting. Whenever I need to depict a group of people, more than 3, more than 4, more than 5, when I want to depict a group of people, like a party speaking, I look at this story because everybody in this story has speaking roles, and he really dispenses with a lot of notions of dialogue attribution, how you have to do it, what's important and what's not. The story is one long digression, and essentially it's this housewarming party. It's somewhere in Connecticut, and they got this, the guy's bragging. And imagine, like in Gilligan's Island, imagine like the Howls. It's this kind of a crowd, The professor might be there, but he's like looking at the weird sculptures and going, and this library that has silver bugs crawling through it, or silverfish crawling through it, and going, Vermes, what, Necronama, what? He's like looking at this stuff, and it's all happening. And then meanwhile, the ex-owner of the home is in an asylum, and it's intercut with him. I believe he's spitting out his tongue, or otherwise he's incapacitated, and he's getting more and more agitated about his pet. that he had to leave behind when they cleaned the house out. And the new homeowners bragging about, well, I got it for nothing. I can't believe it. Like 20 acres here in upstate Connecticut. My goodness. And all this. It was a filthy pigsty. I mean, it was like just annihilated, but it was worth it to have a crew come in here. The building dread is quite palpable. And like I said, it's so much of the 70s. It's so much of the time period without really even going into that. Because I believe the story was published like in 85 or something. I'm not sure where it first appeared. It would have been late 70s. But without a lot of landmarks of that time period. I mean, it's timeless in the sense it could be set today. But it just has this Vincent Price, Boris Karloff, old, Jack Nicholson when he was young and fresh. Nobody knew who he was when he was in some of those Hammer films. This, like, the haunted house that everybody's living in doesn't realize that it's haunted. I really cannot recommend that highly enough. Dark Gods for years has been my writing Bible. I have Ghost Story and Dark Gods, usually pretty near my writing area.
Mm. Well, I used to have a rule that if you see a T.E.D. Klein book at a used bookstore, you get a copy, and you have as many copies as you need. So you always have one that's not torn up.
Yeah.
But you can read the other ones. And literally, like, if I it doesn't, there have been times where I've had 4 copies of Dark Gods.
Get me one, because you know what? I can't find one in Indiana in a used bookstore. They're just not. I've been looking.
You know why? Because I bought all of them in Indiana when I used to live there. I beat you to it.
I certainly can't find a copy at Emptor. I can't find it anywhere. I went to Bloomington to look.
All right. Well,
his stuff is criminal. His stuff is not in print.
No T.E.D. Klein book would remain alive with me being in there. So, Marc, I will mail you a copy here soon. I'm pretty sure I still have.
Oh, dude, I don't. You know what? And this is getting on a diversion for a long time, and David remembers this, hopefully. Maybe he does. No, he said he didn't remember this. I was looking for a copy of I Am Legend when it was out of print, and actually I went to the Lilly Library in Bloomington, and I read an original copy of it. But Agranoff at his house goes, "Hey, I've got a copy of it." And I go, "What?" And he gives me Omega Man, the novelization of Omega Man, which was the original story. They didn't, write a novelization, make a movie in the novel. So I still owe David for that. I mean, it's – and now you can get I Am Legend anywhere, but thanks to Will Smith. But granted, at that point, it was great.
Yeah. So, but back to T.E.D. Klein. I think that's amazing, Laird, that you use it as a writing Bible. That PD is I've never thought of it that way, but that's brilliant. Talking about it as a tracking shot, it's incredible that way. Yeah, that's a great analogy. Anything else you want to say about T.E.D. Klein before we move on?
No, I just think he's an extremely important writer, especially to the horror. If you want to be a horror writer, I think he is essential to at least give him he and Wagner, Bradbury. Those are people I would say check out.
Yeah, and his influence as an editor as well.
Absolutely, Twilight Zone. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for those of us of all of our age, we all read Twilight Zone magazines. So,
yep.
Yeah. So that's where we read a lot of this stuff, and and got a lot of our recommendations for novels with the book reviews as well. So Twilight Zone magazine was a big deal. All right, Marc, your number 2.
Yeah, as you've already said, my number 2 is by Clive Barker. This, and his stories are fantastic. He's the future of horror, as Stephen King said, right there on Books of Blood, right? It was labeled on there in Damnation Game. But this story, again, stuck with me. I loved it. The Body Politic. This comes out of The Inhuman Condition, which was Books of Blood 4. And it means a little bit more to me now, and I'll explain that. But basically, it's about 2 hands who meet on a guy's stomach in the middle of the night, and they start a revolution. And it turns into this gonzo, crazy. I mean, man, that last scene in the story, not the last scene, but there's just visualizing what's happening at this hospital where it starts off one hand cuts off the other, and that hand is supposed to go raise an army and come back and cut off Wright, who's going to be the Messiah. And so they end up at a YMCA, and there's just hands being cut off left and right. it goes crazy. The horror of it, I mean, it's weird, no doubt, and it's gory. The horror of it really comes home to me in the past couple of years. I had 3 years ago, I had surgery, some intestinal surgery. And after that, I started having muscle spasms in my legs that were, and they still happen today. And they were like fasciculations. And of course, what freaked me out about that is it's one of the first signs of ALS. I went to a neurologist, a couple different neurologists, and they said they did some tests on me. Thankfully, it was nothing. It's called benign fasciculation syndrome. And I go, well, how long is this going to last? Because I don't like not being in control of my body. It could last the rest of your life. We don't know what causes it, and there's no solution. The good thing is it's not going to kill you. Well, thank you. I can still tell you when I fall asleep at night, I can still feel my legs moving, like it feels like bugs crawling. And it occurs to me, well, crap. That is kind of what Charlie dealt with when this started. And it was super weird because, again, body horror is one of my favorite. I mean, in some ways it grosses a lot of people out, right? They're like, oh, Possessor or what, David Cronenberg. But to me, I don't get scared by a lot of things, but I find that disturbing, not being able to control your own body. And this story, literally, he can't control his own body because once he realizes what's happening, his hands, the jig is up. His hands are like the emperor has no clothes. We are going to cut your other hand off. For a while, they're doing things in secret. At a point, they're like, no, let's just start. And it becomes this, again, great imagery where Barker describes these hands hanging on a tree, right? And it's almost like fruit being born on this tree. Again, just uber creepy, uber imagery. I don't know why out of all of his stories, that story has really stuck with me. Certainly it's not the most horrific one, but I just love it. And I see myself saying that about a lot of these stories, but I just love the Body Politic.
This is my copy of The Inhuman Condition that I have had since 8th grade. And the Body Politic was a foundational story for me too, because it was the first time I ever saw surrealism working in horror. And as an 8th grader reading it, like that, I understood that this is just super weird. And it was a lightning bolt moment for me because it was like, hey, you can do whatever you want to do with horror. You can make up any weird shit. You can have hands meeting on somebody's stomach to have a revolution, which is just super weird. But that particular scene is such great paranoia. The idea that when you wake up, like, hey, have my hands been up to something while I've been asleep is Philip K. Dick level paranoia. And I'm impressed by that. I actually, a couple years ago, taught writing a horror class for the Horrible Imaginings Film Fest. And my number one story and The Body Politic are the two stories that I taught in that class. So,
I mean, people sleepwalk. Why couldn't, again, your body do whatever it's going to do?
Yeah. I would say that I think his most revolutionary story that just like broke the mold is In the City in the Hills. I think it is both body horror, kind of cosmic, just kind of all weird. And it was also the first story where he had an out character as well. So, which was important for him. All right, my number two, and then I think it'll be anticlimactic if I do number one last because of my particular story. I'm just going to do my 2 and 1, and then I'm just going to switch up the order a little bit. So just so everybody knows. My number 2 is Any Corpse by Brian Evanson. I couldn't not have a Brian Evanson story on here because he's become my like absolute favorite short story writer in the modern. And it's hard because I've become very friendly with Brian. I've had him on the podcast multiple times. We brought him down to Horrible Imaginings, and but Any Corpse, and listen, there are like 15 or 20 Brian Evanson stories that I could put on this list. and I know I just got Rothenberg to read Evanson for the first time recently.
Yeah.
Which
I loved.
Yeah, and then but this story, Any Corpse, has one of the great opening sentences. Probably my favorite opening sentence of all time is Gone South by Robert McCammon. But up there with it is, when she awoke, a shower of flesh had fallen in the field, which is the first opening sentence of Any Corpse. It might be the most grim story I have ever read. It's a surreal horror story about the cannibal trade and what appears to be after the fall of society. To say the story is bonkers is kind of understating it. It's disturbing, but one of the things about Brian Evanson that makes him such a great writer is that he has beautiful prose with all the disturbing stuff that's going on. And I just love that he will use the same name of a character 3 times in the same story and not care if he wants to. And he breaks the rules and doesn't give a shit if it works. And I'm sure it's quite a headache for the editors that work with him, because sometimes he just does that. And in his last book, the glassy burning floor of hell, right, which is just an amazing title to begin with, there's a story called Nameless Citizen. And so it's funny because when I got to the title and I saw Nameless Citizen, I was like, well, the character is going to be called Nameless Citizen throughout the whole thing. And it was, but it worked in a way. And I just think he's the best short story author working. He's like Clive Barker and Thomas Ligotti and Laird Barron, all wrapped into one. And I say that even though Laird's looking at me, which is kind of weird.
with mounting rage.
Yes. But
that's kind of creepy in and of itself, if that's your mounting rage face.
Yeah. When I get mad, I get flat affect.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding. Go ahead.
I just think Brian Evanson, he's got a lot of Tiptree in there. He's got a lot of Alice Sheldon. He teaches genre and fairy tales and all these things, because it all comes out in his fiction. And it's just every word that you read of his, whether it's his Alien tie-in novel or it's his most esoteric surreal fiction, just bleeds genius. I love Brian Evanson as an author, and he's a pretty cool dude too. So that's it. And then I'm going to start number 1 here, and I'm sorry, unless anyone wants to say anything about Brian Evanson.
Well, you said you just turned me on to him, and you did, and I had to pause. I was about to read Immobility. Man, I read Last Days, and I think I texted you when I was 20 pages into it, and I go, yeah, it's got me hooked. It was totally surreal. It just was. And I was like, wow, okay, I'll just go with it. And I did. And I'm happy I did. And I can't wait to read. I have Collapse of Horses, which I haven't read. I'm looking forward to just digesting all of it.
And that is the collection that has Any Corpse in it.
Yeah.
Is a Collapse of Horses. I should mention that. But any collection of Brian Evanson is worth reading. Anything by Brian Evanson is worth reading, even the BK Evanson, kind of more commercial tie-in stuff is great. So anybody else on Brian Evanson? Or?
Yeah. Fuck that guy. No.
He said too many nice things.
Dude, it's that flat affect. He's right.
No, but no, he's one of the great writers. Also, Immobility is one of my very favorite. I got to tell you guys just a real quick Brian Evanson story. This is why I'm just kind of sitting here, because he wrote Immobility, and I thought that was a genius short novel novel, right? Really so good. Genius. And like everything, I mean, the guy's a great writer. And he wrote a story. I don't remember the title now, but there's a one-eyed character, got his eye put out when he was a kid, and really suspiciously familiar type of character. And at the end, he dedicated to Mike Sisko. I'm like, you motherfucker. You weren't writing about Michael Sisko. Who were you? Admit it. And John Langan kind of got in his face, but I never said anything. I was just like, huh. it was a great story. I wasn't offended or anything. I thought it was cool. So we were sitting, I think it was the second time I'd met him. We had hung out at World Fantasy in San Jose back in 2009. So this is like 2012, something like that. Stormy day, winter's day in Providence. And we're all having a dinner, and he's sitting right next to me on my blind side. So I kept having to turn my head, look at him and chat with him. And then Langan, who is one of the biggest instigators that has ever existed in our field, goes, well, you were kind of rude dedicating that story. He's just kidding, but he's like, you were kind of rude dedicating that story to Michael Sisko when it was obviously you were poaching on Laird Barron's childhood and writing about him. Why don't you have the nards to just admit it was for him? And of course, it's just totally pulled his leg, but he did it kind of jokingly, seriously. And I'm sitting there, and he looks at me, he goes, oh, well, did I, like he's a sweet guy.
Yeah.
And he said something to me, and I put my fork down. I was just like this. I went, well, to be honest, Brian, yeah, it did piss me off. And I just went off on him slightly. And he was just like, you could just see, he was just like, oh my God, what have I done? Then I laughed. I patted him on the arm, and I said, no, it's okay. And then I wrote a story, about him called Mobility a couple years ago. About this guy that gets dissected, and by the end of the story, he's a head hanging off a tree. But that's my funny Brian Evanson story. He's a sweet man.
Very sweet.
And we liked to mess with him that one time. That was actually a high point of my trip to Providence.
Yeah, man, to remind me not to hang out with you guys very much. That's brutal. Sounds great.
Well, another good one is his tour novella, The Warren, which we did a bonus episode on Dickheads where we broke down The Warren with Brian. And I would say also too that, and this is the same podcast, but I had him on for Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, and I really picked apart those stories. So I really feel like he taught a lot about writing stories in that. And he gave me a hard time that I gave away all of his secrets in that interview. So I definitely think if you should check out that interview. We also had him on Dickheads to talk about A Canticle for Leibowitz, and his commentary on Canticle for Leibowitz was really great as well. So
Wind Eye is, I haven't read the latest, but Wind Eye is my favorite collection by him. It's one of my favorite collections. Everybody should go get that. I mean, or you get any of them.
Any of them, yeah.
Wind Eye is, I can just speak personal experience. That's one of the great collections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will back Immobility. I'm excited to hear what you think, Marc. If Hollywood came with $1 billion and said you could adapt any novel right now, and we won't stop you because of how weird it is, I would do Immobility, because it's just a bonkers story. It's great. I love it. All right, my number one, and then I'm gonna I will work into the order a little differently so we can end on a story that two of you had. But my number one is Stephen King, and it's The Raft. And I don't think The Raft is his best by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a story that I've taught. I taught it at Horrible Imaginings. It is the story that I have multiple times said was the light bulb story that taught me how to be a storyteller, because it was the first time I read a story. And I went into length about this story in my Only Good Indians interview with Stephen Graham Jones, because he had a similar experience with the story. And so we talked about it a lot. And I know Keene is a big fan of this story too. So I think we talked about it in my Keene interview as well. So I've talked a lot about this story, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But The Raft is the story where I could see everything he was doing to manipulate me as a reader. I could see every rung in the ladder that I was climbing. And every time that he set up something that was going to be scary or was going to be weird or freak me out or be the next step of the story is so in plain sight in The Raft that you could look at it and say, it's not a great story because it's a very obvious story. But to me, it is one that is so perfect in its execution that for a very simple concept, and it was poorly adapted in Creepshow 2. But the story itself is frightening. It sets up isolation. It builds the characters. It has a ticking clock that builds. It has suspense. It has weirdness that you can't explain. And to me, it has everything, every tool in the toolbox. And it's a perfect example of, it's the best horror short story for teaching the form there is. And that is why it's my number one, because you can teach the form, because it's so simple. Another one that you could do that with is there's a Robert McCammon story, a Halloween story that's in Blue World. I think it's something, I can't remember the title. That would be a good one to teach too. I believe it's He Always Comes Knocking, I think is the name of the story. The Robert McCammon one. But I've considered teaching that one as well in the past. So yeah, The Raft. I don't know if anybody has anything they want to add about The Raft, but that's my number one.
It's a good story.
Yeah, I love that story.
What I loved about The Raft, and I agree with you, Dave, because I think we did talk about this long ago when Creepshow 2 came out, is they really lost. I mean, mechanically, they put what they needed to for that adaptation. But what they don't deal with is at the end of The Raft, the main character, well, the character who's still there, again, it's one of those, and Stephen King does it so well, it's that inevitability of the dark fate. He accepts it. He accepts what's going to happen to it. As a matter of fact, he's like, hey, it looks kind of nice. Maybe because it looks so, those colors look so nice, I'll be okay. I just think that it's really good, and I think that is lost certainly in that adaptation. And there's a lot more going on than just simply a lake blob in that story.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. Mary, you were nodding a lot. So do you have feelings on The Raft?
Oh, I do. I love The Raft, but I'll be honest, and this is maybe an unpopular opinion. My first exposure to it was the adaptation in Creepshow, and maybe for the campy fun of it, it got me to go back and read that whole collection. And you're right. I mean, in having read the story, the adaptation misses an awful lot. But the adaptation was fun, you know, but yeah, it's definitely, it became one of my favorite stories, not because it was so, you know, technically or evocatively brilliant, but more because it was old fashioned, just campy horror, just, you know, kids getting into trouble, doing something they're not supposed to, and then they run into a monster. And I've always liked it for that. I've always just appreciated that, that it was fun like that. But the story does deal with, I think, more complexity between the relationships between the characters than the movie actually ever touches on.
Yeah. All right. I think we're next going to go with Mary, your number one.
Okay. My number one. And again, this is a story that I picked as my number one because it is probably one of my favorite short stories of all time. And also because I think there's a significance to the horror genre because of it. And that's Haunter of the Dark by H.P. Lovecraft. It appeared in Weird Tales in 1936 and has been since recollected in, I would say, almost every Lovecraft collection, because of the kind of story it is. And it's one of my favorites because it has all the things in it that I love about cosmic horror. I would even venture to say that it is the reason why I think I fell for cosmic horror in the first place. It's got the ancient tomes, you know, the Necronomicon. It also has his, you know, books created by his friends. It has a really cool monster, and it has, you know, a bit of mystery in what happens to the main character, Robert Blake. And it has a little bit of everything. It's got, you know, superstitious townsfolk. It's got a cult. It's got a creepy church. And it has a building sense of dread. It's amazing how when the main character, from the time the main character finds the church to the time the main character gets to the very, very top room of the church, how the dread sort of builds in this subtle way. You almost don't even notice that you're getting more and more and more tense as he's getting closer and closer to the apex of this church and of what he finds there, and how it sort of how it unravels certain things and reveals certain things as he gets to the top. And that's only like the first part of the story. The rest of it is this impending doom, like where you're waiting for the other horror shoe to drop, because you know this monster's coming. You know that whatever took place in that church has set this monster free, that there's very little that is keeping it from attacking people, and that very little that is protecting the townspeople isn't going to be there for long because of an impending storm. And what I like about it from a sort of I was going to say a hereditary point of view, but that's not the word I'm looking for. Basically from the tradition that has been passed on through the genre, from a inherited point of view, I guess, is that you've got a character, you've got actually a whole tradition that sort of springs up between this story, which is a middle story in a loosely defined trilogy of short stories that started with Robert Bloch. Robert Bloch wrote The Shambler from the Stars, and where he killed off a Lovecraft type character, and then Lovecraft wrote this story where he killed off a Robert Bloch type character, and then I believe Robert Bloch wrote a story subsequent to this, which was a sort of a sequel. And I think that there's something significant in that. There's something, I think that these stories sort of set up a tradition for turning fiction into a mythology, and turning the power, particularly of horror fiction, into something that almost transcends fiction and goes into like urban legend. And partly it was because I don't think Lovecraft cared if people played in the sandbox, basically, and allowed for this building of myth, which because so many people contributed to it, I think really blurs the line between what we know to be absolutely positively fiction and what has become a sort of modern myth. I know that there are people out there that believe the Necronomicon is a real book, that it existed somewhere at some time. And the funny thing is that most of us who know otherwise don't really discourage that. A lot of people don't discourage that because it makes the horror fiction transcendent in a way. And I think that this story, being sort of sandwiched right in between the other two stories, is what I think of as sort of a guidepost, or like a lighthouse kind of light in the dark of fiction that stands above and shows the power that horror fiction can have over time. A legacy, that was the word I was thinking of, that it created a legacy of transcendent horror fiction.
Well, and it's interesting too, because Lovecraft has, the Lovecraft Film Fest was happening just this weekend in Portland, right? And, you have this, even though people know that there's a lot of shady parts of Lovecraft's, beliefs and things like that, his impact is still so strong because, that legacy is there still. Yes. Through all that, we're finding too, with a lot of these problematic figures, we're looking at, for example, like Isaac Asimov, how people found out that, it was a well-known thing that he was very grabby and not cool to the ladies. And so now we're reckoning with learning, this about him. And so with all these classic authors, I think, if you just separate the art from the artist and you look at the impact that Lovecraft had, this story that you picked, for example, being in that legacy of being part of the back and forth with Robert Bloch.
Of the Lovecraft circle, it sort of kicked off that kind of...
Yeah. Yeah, when we were interviewing Betsy Wollheim, she pulled out a handwritten letter that she still has from Lovecraft to her father. And it's like one of those things when you think it's easy to forget that Lovecraft was a human being at all, that was writing these letters, the good and the bad, that these letters were written, they were handwritten by someone. And I think it was a huge foundational thing for me when she held up this letter and we could look at his handwriting. And I know Brian, and were you there too? When
I was there too. Yep.
Yeah. When you guys went through the papers, that had to be to see those there in front of you must have been just an amazing thing. So, anything else on Lovecraft before we get to Laird's number one?
No, just listen to what you guys are saying, and it is becoming tougher. But in the case of to separate art from artist, all that, whether you even should. But I will say this: it's far easier when they're dead and have no estate for us to separate. That makes it easier for me.
True. Yeah.
You're not contributing to that. You're not contributing to a direct legacy. You're contributing. It's easier to look at the ideas and go, okay. I said once long ago that because I've written a lot of Lovecraftian stuff, I said, but my take on it is to look past him and look at what he was looking at. I try to imagine nothing's nascent. The only thing that's nascent about an artist is their interpretation of input, of data, of stimulation or stimuli. Lovecraft didn't invent anything. Lovecraft interpreted his world, and what you get is a filter. So my tactic has always been, and what I recommend to other people, don't throw out Lovecraft, even if he's, if you can't even stomach him. But if you're interested in cosmic horror, look at what he was looking at, Dunsany and the Bible, for example, the Mahabharata. There's cosmic horror is an ancient concept. So I would just toss that out.
I would agree, and hopefully you can hear me. I switched
I hear you.
You actually sound better now.
Oh, good. Well, I wish I would have known that because I'd be using this for video court instead of my headphones. I think that's the legacy, and I think you have to accept that legacy of what he started because, I mean, what's his name? I forgot the author's name. Ballad of Black Tom, that came out a couple of years ago.
Victor LaValle. Of course,
I think
Victor
that
LaValle
legacy
gets mentioned. He always gets mentioned.
Yeah. But it brings it full circle. We wouldn't have what we would have today if not for Lovecraft's writing and that kickoff between the circle of Lovecraft, whatever you want to call it, regardless of Lovecraft's ideas. You take the good with the bad. And it was bad. Don't get me wrong. But it's there. Back to what Mary said about some people accepting some of the Lovecraftian stuff for real. I was with a friend of mine. We were at a convention and we saw this artist who had drawn a picture. He had painted a picture of the Mad Arab and Lovecraft sort of looking at this book and of the Necronomicon. And I go, that's pretty interesting. And the guy goes, it's interesting because, and I can't tell if it was a joke or not. I tend to believe he was being 100% honest when he goes,
here we go.
Because they didn't live at the same time. And I go, okay. And that was it. I mean, he believed the Mad Arab was a real person, wrote the Necronomicon, and we're done. Okay.
See, for me, and
that's good in some ways.
And it is, that aspect of Lovecraft's work, I find sort of fascinating that people, that they do riff on everything from pastiche to parody. And like we were saying, he as a person had some incredibly awful views. I believe a lot of them, and this is not an excuse, I believe a lot of them were xenophobia and a fear of change, which was so pervasive in his personality that totally. It was crippling to, but I think that, I struggle with this because I think you wouldn't have had that deep sense of fear of the other without a man who genuinely was afraid of the other. But what I think of as the legacy too is not that we have to rehash his version, his view, like Laird said, his perspective of what the other is, but that we can evolve cosmic horror, that we can reclaim it and rework it and make it something that isn't stagnant and that doesn't die on the vine because of this man's stilted approach, but rather be something that can evolve as we evolve and still keep the basic tenets of what makes cosmic horror scary.
And it is great that so many Black authors have done a really great job of translating Lovecraft, Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Laval, but also this year M.K. Jemison's The City We Become. Just really it's kind of a spoiler that it's Lovecraftian, but I think that if you read The Dust Jacket, you can kind of figure it out. But that book too, like, she won the Hugo 3 times in a row and is in conversation with Lovecraft in her most recent novel. And, that's a big thing. So I think that's,
and what Mary says is right, though. Without a guy so flawed to the point where he was almost paranoid with his xenophobia, you're not getting this cosmic horror. I mean, you're not. You could take, the whole, his famous quote, "the fear of the unknown," and just insert any foreign nationality in that. And for someone who's deeply prejudiced, it's there. It's horrible. It's foundational. But that's what formed what he came up with, right? It's hard to reconcile, right? But I agree with Laird, and I agree with Mary. I mean, it's easy to say that was the times we were in, but if you think about those times, he even had extreme views for his time. Yeah, he did.
I think made people uncomfortable. But and Laird is absolutely right that there are certain aspects of things that inspired him were much older than he did rip a lot off from mythology to begin with. But I think if you're to read Lovecraft now and appreciate Lovecraft's work for itself, then I think the reason why it still works was not because he was a horrific racist, but because he was genuinely afraid of the things he was writing about.
I would agree.
Which is kind of why I think The Exorcist works, because Blatty was genuinely believed in, the Roman Catholic tenets that included, possession and exorcism, and but it's a constant struggle, especially if you're a person who writes cosmic horror all the time. Even in Haunter of the Dark, there's some questionable stuff in there. He doesn't say the nicest things about Italians, who are my peeps, He doesn't say the nicest things about women, but
I just broke down. I just did our 30th Philip K. Dick novel, and I've learned a lot of unpleasant things about Philip K. Dick during the process of doing this podcast. But it doesn't mean that I don't see the value in what we're doing and doing it. So now another science. Now the last two are both science fiction writers as well. So Laird, now this author is somebody who John Shirley gave me a browbeating for having not read this author, and I fixed that 15 years ago. But you're number one.
Yeah, Jack Vance. I think pound for pound, he can hold his own or whip everybody on this list. Whatever. Objectively, I feel that way. I feel he's like a supreme writer in general, but he specialized in a certain Baroque fantasy. But every now and then he delved into horror. And for my money, this isn't the best horror story that I could have picked. I think the best horror story, and I almost picked it, but I already had too many classical stories on here as far as I was concerned, is To Build a Fire by Jack London. I don't think there's a better horror story than that. I don't think there's necessarily a better cosmic horror story than that, because it encapsulates the nature, which is the entire universe, is indifference to finite carbon-based life forms. But enough about that. I will say one other thing. It is funny that you guys talking about the Raft, because the Raft and To Build a Fire actually do share a very central conceit, and that is, oh, I'll get out of this. I'll just build a fire. We'll get out of this. You distract it, and I'll go swim. In other words, all the hope seems, in the light of day, everything seems like it's going pretty well, and this situation can be rectified. It's only after a little while you realize that you were just absolutely screwed from the start. But Vance's story is Liane the Wayfarer, which appeared in Dying Earth. It was collected in Dying Earth. I included it because I think it's just chilling and a really clever horror story. It's also, I think, the only dark fantasy horror story on my list, and but it's also sort of in a science fictional background. The Dying Earth is, a hybrid between those two ideas. Also, I think it's the only one on my list that involves a serial killer, because Liane is this beautiful, or Leanne, I always pronounce it with the E on the end, but he is this beautiful bard, ladies man, who is diabolically evil. He is like satanically evil. He meets people and murders them, takes their stuff, rapes them, whatever he wants to do. And of course, Vance is very genteel in his description, so he lets a lot of its implication. But essentially, what happens is old Liane, who's just like one of the worst people on the planet, he runs into this, like a witch of the grove, a dryad of the grove type of thing, and he has to have her. But he runs to grab her, and she managed to escape into her little cottage that has sort of magically appeared in this glade. And he knows that that it's booby trapped. And Vance always has these fantastical descriptions for things, like he would be pierced in 1,000 places by the great lances that would come out of the needles that would come out of her house. So she says, you can have me, but you need to do a chore for me. And she had been exiled from her homeland, and she's trying to rebuild this tapestry. And if you can go get me a golden thread, or even bring me the other half of my tapestry, that would be great. And he goes, where is it? And she tells him that, this dude in this ancient ruins, Chun, is holding on to it. He's this terrible person, but you should be able to handle him, a clever guy like yourself. So off he goes. And I won't ruin the story. It's because it digresses quite a bit. Along the way, he finds this hoop. It's like a ring. It's a magic ring. But it can expand. And when you drop it down over yourself, you can actually pick it back up, and you're in an alternate dimension. Like, you're completely self-contained. You put it on the ground, step in it, pull it back up over yourself, and you're outside again. It shrinks down to a ring. And he's like, oh, this could come in handy. And off he goes to go retrieve, this tapestry. So I'll leave it at, the other half of the tapestry. And so I'll leave it at that. But it's amusing. He's one of the rare authors, and Roald Dahl. Go back to Roald Dahl. He possesses this ability, this light touch, to say things with a smile that are suggestive of the worst traits of man or beast.
Yeah. Speaking of John Shirley, Jack Vance is like his childhood favorite author, and he just released a fantasy novel that is so Jack Vance. It's his like loving tribute to Jack Vance. And
Michael Shea did the same thing. He got his permission to do a sequel to one of his novels. So
yeah. And well, John's is an original world, but it's very, very influenced. But what I will say too is what you're talking, I know the story you're talking about, because it was the Dying Earth books they're kind of sold and marketed as novels a lot of times, but he wrote these stories serialized through various science fiction magazines, and many of them stand on their own.
Absolutely. It has, and that story, Liane the Wayfarer, has one of the greatest lines. It's not the end line by any means. It's just a line in the story that's one of the most chilling you'll ever hear. And it's, I'm Chun, the unavoidable. I say that all the time when somebody annoys me. I just live around Chun, the unavoidable. They're like, oh God. To my friends who've read it. So absolutely. Dying Earth, you should just read Dying Earth. It's an easy entry point into Vance.
For some reason, I never read Dying Earth, but Demon Princes, those novels aren't they great? Some of my favorite.
And those
are my favorites. Oh yeah,
some of the best hand-to-hand combat I've ever read. I don't care even whether the level of the realism is just the combat, because every now and then he'll have a hand-to-hand scene and they are just spectacular. Of course, he was a military guy, so I'm sure he's...
It's interesting because when Amazon paid that $1 billion to do Lord of the Rings, right, or to do a new series of Lord of the Rings, and everyone kept saying, like, there's so many other fantasy works that you could do. One of the things, John and I had this whole conversation about, like, just imagine if they were smart enough to pick up the Dying Earth books and get the right person to adapt it. But
absolutely, or the Star Kings, either.
Yeah, or do a proper treatment of Earthsea, but to do Lord of the Rings again, when we could do that. Yeah, it's unfortunate. Marc, you're going to close us out because this was Mary's number 10. And it's interesting that of all human beings we end with frickin' Harlan. All right.
First of all, I'm going to tell anyone who has not read this story, I'm going to tell you not to read this story. I'm going to tell you to seek out the Harlan Ellison audiobook version of this story. Oh. Because there's something about Harlan reading Harlan. You can just feel the angst and the anger and the crotchetiness, and especially coming through this story. Again, this is a story of body horror, but it's even more than that. It's going back to what Laird just said about the "we'll get out of this." At no point in this story, which is I have no mouth and I must scream, is anyone saying we'll get out of this, because it's just hopeless. Mary, I don't know if you'd agree, but you just feel like this is just, it's a hopeless situation. It takes place in the future after World War III. Mm-hmm. There were like 3 computers called they're called AM now, AM, but they were various things. They were supercomputers. There was one in China, one in Russia, one in America. And after the war, they kind of all got together what's it called? Skynet, basically, and decided, hey, you know what? We're better than these humans. And for some reason, it kept 5 people around. And it just toys with them for hundreds of years. And it's able to be omnipresent, omniscient. It's got, evidently, it can recreate reality. It can change the physical and mental states of people. It turns one person into like a simian. It turns one person who was gay into a heterosexual. It just messes with people, this computer, on a level that is beyond cruel. I mean, it is. And that's the horror in it. In the very end of the story, and I don't want to give it away, but there's a quote where he explains, the narrator explains what the computer has done to him, and he's been largely untouched. But at the very end, it's one of the most horrific images when you read the paragraph that I've ever heard described. And I hope there's never an adaptation of it. And there might already be an adaptation somewhere, but I hope there was a computer game, but I hope there's never an adaptation of it, because I want my imagination focused on that description. And I just find it one of the most horrific paragraphs in all of literature.
I agree. Most horror stories, I think, at least most that I can think of, are predicated on the idea that there at least is the appearance of hope until there isn't. And, and then the horror exists in the fact that, oh no, all this time you were really screwed and you didn't know it. This horror story, like Marc said, there never is any hope. And you know that going in. It's almost, which would make it almost a very heavy read to begin with. But I think what bothered was definitely the end. It was definitely the end. And I think and I'm not as well versed in science fiction, but I know that there's some science fiction that basically deals with what would happen if computers gained some form of sentience and beyond just the ability intellectually to cognitively process things. And having
Singularity
worked
is the,
right,
is the genre.
and for having worked with the Institute of Electronics and Electrical Engineers, I was one of their editors. So I worked on the robotics journal. And so I saw a lot of what they were talking about, like how they develop AI. It's actually kind of funny too, that they go by Asimov's laws of robotics in real robotics to make sure that these robots don't ever take over the planet or anything. But it's one thing to ponder what would happen if the robotics ever gained a sense of self-awareness, a soul. It's another thing to wonder what would happen if they gained like a deity kind of level, a godlike kind of level, because we would assume that the horror would stem from the fact that they would be unmoved by emotion or impassioned response, that everything would be super logical. And yet, like Marc said, this robot God is cruel. And I think the thing that got me was that it felt like Ellison was saying that the evolution of this kind of cold indifference, this robotic indifference, isn't logic, but sadism. That the highest evolution of a thing like this would be something that develops a sense of cruelty and enjoys it. And I always thought that was really kind of terrifying, because it may be you can fight something that only thinks logically by reasoning with it with logic, but you can't fight sadism because there is no logic behind sadism.
Cruelty and intellect are conjoined. The cruelest animals in nature have a tendency to be the smartest.
Yes.
The more they're like us, the more that they're capable. They don't always exhibit that, but
they're capable of it. Absolutely.
Yeah. So it stands. If you were going to simulate intellect as a machine, you would almost by default have to simulate cruelty.
And that's terrifying, because that would mean that any power above us, anything that we would think of as a god, would then almost scientifically have to be a real son of a bitch, like a really evil, sadistic kind of being. And I've always found that.
And who better to write a mean computer than Harlan Ellison?
I'm not gonna lie. His story was number 10 because he's Harlan Ellison.
Oh, he's a jerk. And David told me a great story where he met Harlan Ellison.
I have 3 meeting Harlan Ellison stories, and all 3 of them are hilarious.
So we have Lovecraft, but we have Ellison. No, we need to go within our corners and think about why Lovecraft is okay, but Ellison he's not been dead long enough, is my point, and he hasn't escaped.
Exactly.
I will say this about the computer, and what you said is exactly right, Laird and Mary. There is that level of cruelty. But then it goes even a little bit farther than just being cruel. Him being cruel is, again, the computer. He turned a gay man heterosexual. He made a girl who was, she claimed to be chaste. He made her basically a sex object by her own desire, according to the book, right? He changed an older man, and he changed his name. He played with these people in a very cruel way. But at the very end, it's not just cruelty. It's now cruelty mixed with punishment, because, and I don't want to, again, give away the end of the story, but there's something that happens that makes him punish the narrator of the book. So it's not just cruelty for cruelty's sake. Now it's, you've now really made me mad, and I'm going to show you what I'm really going to do to you.
It's a great story. And I think one of the reasons why Harlan was such a great short story writer, but not really a great novelist, is because he was so impatient with his ideas as well, too. Like but hey, if you want an author who looks at the singularity in really interesting ways, but has a little bit kinder heart, Rudy Rutger has written several novels on the singularity, and his software. There's 4 books. I don't know, quadrilogy, or if you call it that, but the software, wetware, hardware, those books are phenomenal. And Rudy is a really sweet guy too. But just to give like a good guy a little promo,
a little boost.
Yeah. But I would say, go ahead.
I was going to say, as Mary said, again, a God. I mean, if you look at our history with religion in the sense of the religious beliefs, the Judeo-Christian Bible and all of that, yeah, look, I'm Jewish. I'll be the first one to tell you, Old Testament God, he is the son of a bitch, right? He punishes. I mean, there's very little mercy, and that is exactly what Harlan Ellison puts on the page. Again, read the thing, listen to him, but that one of those final paragraphs, man, I mean, on my notes for today, I wrote the whole final paragraph out just because it's just brutal. This is a brutal thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a story that deserves all the attention that it gets. It's, regardless of, how many times I've watched Harlan make organizers of conventions cry. I
have seen it happen
with my own eyes. But
when I talked to you last year, David, about this idea of doing this podcast after your novel podcast, I think I got really excited about this, and I think I sent you my list like immediately afterwards, and you laughed. And you go, "We're not doing this for a while." And I said, "Okay," but my number one story did not change, and I reread all of these stories just thinking, "All right, let's move some stuff around," and I did move some things around. It's still the most horrific story to me.
Yeah, I agree, and I also agree with Laird that I think it's a matter of distance. Having met Harlan once, he put me off a little bit, but I can't deny that the man is good. He was good at what he did, and thankfully I never had to meet Lovecraft. But you're right, it's a matter of distance. So maybe.
Look, I never met him. I just know that he was a jerk. So there you go. To put it politely,
he can be really kind to people too. Ask Octavia Butler.
Yeah.
Like Harlan was foundational for her career, and she considered Harlan to be a saint. Just because of their situation. John Shirley recently told me a story that on this podcast about how, and I had to get more clarification, but he told a funny story about dropping acid and like climbing in a tree at Clarion and throwing things at Harlan. So he got lots of good revenge. For years, I guess Harlan was mad at John Shirley because he climbed in a tree and threw things at him. So that can make you feel better. But let's go around, close things out. Mary and Laird, I want you to be able to tell people how they can find your work. But also just sum up for the people who listen to this as short story authors who wanted to get a glimpse into, what they can learn from this list, from your list in particular, like kind of something summing it up. Marc, you want to start us off?
All I can say is I was really looking forward to this today. I've written a huge amount of notes just because as David mentioned, I'm a huge genre fan. I feel just honored to be here. I still kind of feel like I'm probably not the person who should have done this, but that's okay. It's been fantastic. Hey, and again,
I called on you for a reason.
I know. I love the discussion, and you can't find me anywhere. I'm just a guy who works in a government courtroom. So, whatever.
Well, they could get arrested to find you, but
no, they really can. Look, I used to do that. Now I just deal with like drainage ditches and stuff, which is kind of boring. But again, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Good to meet you.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I'm ever honored to be in your guys' presence again, it would be my pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.
Marc, you did a great job. Thank you for joining us today. Mary, summing up.
Oh, again, I want to echo Mark. Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun, and I was really, honored to be on this panel. I think what you could, to answer your question, I think what you could get out of this list, I tend to favor cosmic horror, but I basically like any kind of supernatural horror that really gets to the psychology of humanity to understand why the supernatural story, like why the supernatural antagonist is scary. I like the scary stuff. I like the stuff that has an emotional, gut punch. And I think that the stories that we talked about, I think they have that. And if you want to find me, all the books I currently have available are on Amazon. If you want a nice, neat, tidy little list, you can look at marysangiovanni.com. I know it's a big, long Italian last name, but if you put in Mary, Sangi, I should pop up. So. Right.
Hey, and tell Brian he did a good job being quiet and not interjecting his opinions.
I'm very proud of him. I'm very proud of him.
He just ruined everything.
Well, he was over there dying, wanting to say.
No, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
He was dying. At least a couple of those stories, he was just like, "Oh my god, I want to say something."
I don't know if you could hear, but there were the occasional mutterings, but they were very quiet and respectful. I thought, where he wanted to add his 2 cents.
Yeah, well,
now I feel even worse about myself on this panel because I know that Brian Keene was listening to me.
Well, hey, no, I gotta say, there were many people who would have been worthy of this panel. So it was but for very specific reasons, I chose who I did. And but Brian, you did a great job. I would have loved to have heard your opinion on some of them. So,
hey, buddy.
Yeah, just you wait. He's like, I'll get revenge. I'll do my own.
You did be in the comments section.
Yeah, Laird.
This is for Brian. First of all, read Brian Keene, but also I know that he's a big Jack Ketchum fan, and Jack Ketchum could have been on this list a bunch of times. There are a lot of people that could have been on this list, but Ketchum, I suspect that's one of what Brian would have selected Ketchum. So
absolutely,
I actually have to get the hell out of here. I'm actually running late for something else. So let me just say really quickly, we didn't touch what you should get out of this panel is we did not touch to the Jack Ketchum example. We didn't even scratch the surface of not only good writers, but essential writers.
Yeah.
So take that. If you take anything away from this is just a tiny primer. This is the tip of the iceberg. Yep. You can find me on Twitter and Facebook under my name. And with that, I'm going to bid you all a good evening. And thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you, Laird.
Thank you very much. It was great to meet you.
All right. Yeah. Good night, guys.